Good afternoon, students. So in today's video, we're going to talk about how to avoid plagiarism by using credible sources, how to find credible sources, and about how using credible sources can help us avoid plagiarism and avoid bias. And so here, once again, I'm going to be using this book, Rules for Writers, 8th edition. And I'm using the 8th edition because that's the only edition that I have on my bookshelf. So that's what I'm using for, and that's also the edition that's also the textbook that you'll be using for your English 101 class and English 105 class if you're in my Los Angeles Pacific University student. And so without further ado, I will then go over how to avoid plagiarism by finding credible sources. So using sources responsibly. Be especially careful when using copy and paste functions in electronic files. Some researchers plagiarize their sources because they lose track of how many words came from sources. So to prevent unintentional plagiarism, put quotation marks around any source text that you copy during your research. So that way, Turnitin will not flag your paper as plagiarism. So there are 3 kinds of note-taking: summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. Be sure to keep track of exact page references for all 3 types of notes. You will need the page numbers later if you use the information in your paper. And it is good practice to indicate in your notes if you have summarized, paraphrased, or quoted the author's words to avoid unintentionally plagiarizing a source. Summarizing without plagiarizing. A summary condenses information and captures main ideas, perhaps reducing a chapter to a short paragraph or a paragraph to a single sentence. A summary should be written in your own words. If you use phrases from the source, put them in quotation marks. Academic English. Even in the early stages of note-taking, it is important to keep in mind that in the United States, written texts are considered an author's property. This property isn't a typical object, so it is often referred to as intellectual property. The author or the publisher owns the language as well as any original ideas contained in the writing, whether the source is published in print or digital form. When you use another author's property in your own writing, you are required to follow certain requirements and conventions for citing the material, or you risk committing plagiarism. Here is a passage about marine pollution from a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration website. Following the passage are the students' annotations on the source, notes and questions that help him figure out the meaning, and then the summary of the passage. And so here you have the notes of what the students did. And here, a question is often posed to the NOAA Marine Debris Trash Program. To the Marine Debris Program. How much debris is actually out there? The MDP has recognized the need for this answer, as well as the growing interest and value of citizen science. So let's just stop right here. So a question is often posed. By whom? To the NOAA Marine. So different ways of saying Marine Debris Program. You could say the Ocean Trash Program. And instead of saying citizen, instead of saying monitoring and assessment protocols, you could paraphrase in your own words ways of gathering information. And instead of saying debris composition, you could say kinds of materials. And instead of saying abundance, you could say how much. And instead of saying impact, you can say why it matters. So you could always simplify or put into your own words the sources or the direct source that you get from a source. But even if you paraphrase a source, you still have to cite the source. So like a summary, a paraphrase is written in your own words, but whereas a summary reports significant information in fewer words than the source, a paraphrase restates the information in roughly the same number of words. A successful paraphrase also uses sentence structure that's different from the original. If you retain occasional choice phrases from the source, use quotation marks so that later you'll know which phrases are not your own. If you paraphrase, you must still cite the source. Using quotation marks to avoid plagiarizing. A quotation consists of the exact words from a source. In your notes, put all quoted materials in quotation marks. Do not assume you will remember what you quoted. So this way you'll know which part of the information is from the original text and which part of the material is from the source. So how do you avoid plagiarism from the web? Understand what plagiarism is. When you use another author's intellectual property, language, visuals, or ideas in your own words, in your own writing, without giving proper credit, that's plagiarism. Trust web sources the same way you trust print sources. Any language that you find on the web must be cited, even if the material is in the public domain, which generally includes older works no longer protected by copyright law, or is publicly accessible on free sites. When you use materials from websites sponsored by federal, state, or municipal governments, or by nonprofit organizations, you must acknowledge that material too. Keep track of which words come from sources and which are your own. Avoid websites that bill themselves as research services and sell essays. Evaluating sources. You can often locate dozens or even hundreds of potential sources. So I always teach my students KAPOW. C for currency, A for author, P for purpose, O for objectivity, and W for writing style. KAPOW. So think about how sources might contribute to your writing. How you plan to use sources in your paper will affect how you evaluate them. Not every source must directly support your thesis. Sources can have a range of functions in a paper. They can provide background information, explain terms or concepts, provide evidence for your argument, lend authority to your argument, identify a gap or contradiction in the conversation, offer counter-arguments and alternative interpretations to your argument. So those are the functions of sources for your paper. So viewing evaluation as a process. When you use sources in your writing, make a habit of evaluating or judging the value of these sources. Evaluate as you plan. What kind of sources do I need? Evaluate as you read. What positions do these sources have? Evaluate as you search. Are these sources reliable? Evaluate as you write. How do these sources help prove my point? And so, as you plan, you will need to think through the kinds of sources that will help you fulfill your purpose. The following are notes. So always use KAPOW if you want to have credible sources. Never use Wikipedia as a source because that's not reliable. And don't trust ChatGPT and think that everything that ChatGPT says is reliable. You still need to double check to make sure that whatever the AI, ChatGPT, says, their sources actually exist. And you still need to cite ChatGPT if you use it as a source. Select sources worth your time and attention. As you search for sources in databases, the library catalog, and search engines, you're going to get a lot of hits. But I always tell students the most reliable sources are peer-reviewed sources that you can find in your online library databases and on Google Scholar. And so preview the source, make sure that it fits kapow, currency within the last 10 years. A, author, that it's written by an expert. P, purpose, that it's not an advertisement, because advertisements always lead you astray, because all advertisements care about is selling their product and not always telling the truth. O, objectivity, you want something neutral. And W, writing purpose, make sure it has a thesis, professional looking writing, no grammar mistakes, and it's written by an expert. Actually, kapow is very similar to ethos, pathos, and logos, and you got to have ethos, pathos, and logos to have a convincing argument that is valid. Select appropriate versions of online sources. Make sure you use scholarly sources, not popular sources like the National Enquirer. And so determining if a source is scholarly. So an online source may appear as an abstract, an excerpt, or a full-text article or book. It is important to distinguish among these versions of sources and use a complete version of a source, preferably one with page numbers for your research. Abstracts and excerpts are shortened versions of complete works. An abstract, a summary of a work's content, might appear in a database record for a record and can give you clues. How can you tell if your source is scholarly? For many college assignments, you will be asked to use scholarly sources. These are written by experts for a knowledgeable audience and usually go into more depth than books and articles written for a general audience. Scholarly sources are sometimes referred to as peer-reviewed articles. That's just what I said, peer-reviewed articles, because the work is evaluated by experts in the field before publication. To determine if a source is scholarly, you should look for the following: formal language and presentation, authors who are academics or scientists, footnotes or a bibliography documenting the works cited by the author in the source, original research and interpretation rather than a summary of other people's work, original quotations from an analysis of primary sources, a description of research methods, or a review of related research. In some databases, searches can be limited to peer review source. So read with an open mind. And so an excerpt is the first few sentences or paragraphs of a newspaper or magazine article. Abstracts and excerpts often provide enough information for you to determine whether the complete article would be useful for your paper. So when you read the article, read with an open mind. As you begin reading these sources, keep an open mind. Do not let your personal beliefs prevent you from listening to what the article says. And also be open to new and opposing viewpoints. Be curious about the wide range of positions in the research conversation you are entering. Your research question should guide you as you engage your sources. When you read critically, you are examining an author's assumption, assessing evidence, and weighing conclusions. Reading critically means reading carefully. What does the source say? Reading skeptically. Are any of the author's points problematic? Reading evaluatively. How does this source help make my argument? Using sources responsibly. Take time to read the entire source and try to understand the author's arguments, assumptions, and conclusions. Try to avoid taking quotations from the first few pages of a source before you understand if the words and ideas are represented. In other words, read the whole thing, okay? Before you start taking quotations, read the whole article first. Make sure you understand the whole article as a whole before you start taking quotes, so that you understand the entire context of the author's point of view and to avoid misinterpreting and taking out of context somebody's article. Distinguishing between primary and secondary sources. A primary source is something that somebody witnessed firsthand, and a secondary source is somebody who wrote about that first experience. And so as you begin assessing evidence in a source, determine whether you are using a primary or secondary source. Primary sources include original documents such as letters, diaries, legislative bills, laboratory studies, field research reports, and eyewitness accounts. Secondary sources are commentaries on primary sources, another writer's opinion about or interpretation of a primary source. Although a primary source is not necessarily more reliable than a secondary source, it has the advantage of being a first-hand account. And so you can better evaluate what a secondary source says if you have read both first and primary, if you have first read any primary sources it discusses. This will give you more context. Another thing that when you read, being alert for signs of bias. Bias is a way of thinking, a tendency to be partial that prevents people and publications from viewing a topic objectively. So O in kapow is you don't want to have to read a biased article. You want your paper to be non-biased. So in other words, it's got to be objective, in which you neutral. In other words, neutral. So both in print and online, some sources are more objective than others. If you are exploring the rights of organizations like WikiLeaks to distribute sensitive government documents over the internet, for example, you may not find objective, unbiased information in a U.S. State Department report. If you are researching timber harvesting practices, you are likely to encounter bias in publications sponsored by environmental groups. As a researcher, you will need to consider any suspected bias as you assess the source. If you are uncertain about a source, whether it's biased or not non-biased, you can always ask your librarian. And so, assessing the author's argument. So make sure that the argument is valid. So evaluating all sources. So check for bias. Does the author or publisher endorse political or religious views? Is the author or publisher associated with a special interest group such as PETA or the National Rifle Association that might present only one side of an issue? Are alternative views presented and addressed? How fairly does the author treat the opposing view? Does the author's language show signs of bias? Assessing an argument. What is the author's central claim? How does the author support his claim? Are the statistics consistent with his claim? Are any of his assumptions questionable? Does the author consider opposing arguments and refute them persuasively? Does the author fall prey to logical fallacies? So assess websites with care. Sources found on the web can provide valuable information, but before you go looking up stuff on the web, you've got to make sure that your source is credible. You got to make sure it's not an advertisement. And if you use Google, you're going to get everything, ads and everything. And so use Google Scholar. Google Scholar only has scholarly sources, so that's better for your paper. But noted, Google Scholar gives abstracts. It may not give you access to the complete article. So if you want access to the complete article, you need to go to your school's online library. But because Google Scholar gives you a lot of abstracts, but when you go to your school's online library, that's where you have access to the entire article, not just the abstract, and you have access to the peer-reviewed articles. Why the difference? That's because your school pays a fee to those databases in order to have complete access to all those articles. That's why the best place to do your research for peer-reviewed articles, especially if you want the whole thing, is using your school's online library. And then when you go into the search box to put in the library your topic name, you also have to circle or check, I also want peer-reviewed articles. That way, when the search engine in your school library searches for the articles, it will only pick out peer-reviewed articles for you to read. That's very important. And so when you evaluate sources on the web, you should check for authorship, sponsorship, purpose and audience, and currency. So this is kapow. So the A in kapow, authorship. So is the author of the article an expert? Is he or she knowledgeable? Sponsorship, that's the P in kapow. Purpose, is it an ad? Okay, so if it's an ad and if it's a sponsored article, forget it. That is just not credible. You dismiss it. And then also P stands for purpose. Okay, purpose and audience. Why was this article created? Once again, is it an ad? Who is the intended audience? And then the C in kapow, currency. How current is this article? If the article is older than 10 years, then it's too obsolete, too old. So here they have it evaluating the source, okay? And so evaluating and checking a source and seeing if the last update is December 19th, 2012, and today is December 20th, 2012, then okay, this is a current article. But if you're seeing this as, we're now in July 2nd, 2023, oh, this is way too old. The last time anybody was on the website was in 2012, and we're in 2023, then this article is way too old, and that means that this website's been abandoned. So forget about it. So that's one way in which you can evaluate a website and check for its reliability. And then you want to check for its purpose. So here, this site is sponsored by a company or some kind of ad or advertisement. So right away, if you see that it's sponsored content, forget it. So I hope that this video helps you understand how to evaluate sources on the web. And once you have credible evidence for your paper, you will have a credible paper that avoids bias and fallacies. So if you have any questions about this video, you can always email me anytime.